Welcome everyone. Today we're continuing on through chapter 7 here in the book of Romans. Last lesson covered the first 6 verses. Today we are progressing from verse 7 through to 12. Okay, so Romans chapter 7 verses 7 to 12. We're in again another follow-on in this very Socratic form in which this middle portion of the book of Romans is written, right? Socratic referring to the concept of question, answer, kind of all trailing and traversing on in concourse from one subject or area to another. Right? Verse 7 is going to have a follow-on from the things that we discussed in last lesson concerning what is really ultimately this aspect of the nature of the law. We'll talk about that, what it means once we get into it, as well as then some of the specific metaphysics of the law and the concept of goodness or righteousness as it relates to the law, based on that rhetorical question in verse 7. So let's read the passage and then dive right in. Romans chapter 7, verses 7 to 12. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. Rather, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, quote, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, worked out in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Now I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And this commandment, which was to lead unto life, was found to lead unto death for me. For sin, taking an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and righteous, and good. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so opening verse for us, verse 7, gives us a rhetorical question, right? As we've been pretty well accustomed to, as I mentioned in the intro. What shall we say then, based on what had been previously said? Okay, referring obviously to the first 6 verses, but primarily to what we saw in regard to verses 4, 5, and 6. I'll just recap what that was, obviously, just to read verses 4, 5, and 6 for you. So, my brothers, you were also made to die to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might be joined to another, namely, to him who was raised from the dead, referring to Christ, in order that we might bear fruit unto God. For while we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were inflamed by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we have been released from the law, in reference to its mastery, okay? That specifically referring back to verse 1, right? The law having master over a person as long as it is. Having died, verse 6, we've been released from the law, having died to that by which we were constrained, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter, okay? That question specifically now builds on the idea, well, the retort back hypothetically in this Socratic idea, or format I should say, so that St. Paul is following, is the law sin? Okay, so in other words, really what he's highlighting on is verse 5. Okay, that's really the crux of where this line of questioning is coming from, right? While we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were inflamed by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. Well, the question that then can be asked back in retort is that if the law inflamed sin, then is the law itself evil? Do you understand, right? So that is it's a logical question to ask. It's certainly not an irrational one. Of course, the exclamation may never be, right? And so now he's about to dismantle that potential query or counter-argument, okay? So the essence of that short, pithy question, is the law sin? In other words, is the law evil? Okay, is actually an extremely important one that has been building up and building up and building up, right? it's not really a surprise in any meaningful sense that this kind of question, apart from the fact that it's following the logical course of what's been discussed so far, is coming on the tail end of what had already been discussed in the first 3 chapters, okay, which is all regarding the inherent corruption of the human condition, okay? Because what that does in his line of argumentation is it already establishes the basis from which he can answer this question, right? If it had hypothetically been the other way around, he would then have to launch into an entire discourse of what it is for us, chapters 1 to 3, trying to backtrack to explain, or backfill to explain, the source and origin of evil being mankind and not the divine law, right? So by doing that initially, he's already laid groundwork that can then just immediately plug into this question, if that makes sense. Okay? Ultimately here, so that we understand kind of philosophical basis before we start to get in through to the rest of even verse 7. Right? The question itself, ultimately, whilst obviously quite namely about the law, right? Is the law sin or is the law evil? I'll be using those terms interchangeably for obvious reasons. On the surface, prima facie is regarding the law itself. Ultimately, the necessity for defending this argument or defending this question is rooted actually in a defense of God himself, okay? Because God is the source of the law, it's why we call it the lex divina, or the divine law, okay? All goodness and righteousness, which is the very phraseology which he uses at the ending of verse 12, for where we'll get to and land on today, obviously. The concepts of goodness and righteousness, righteousness being a synonym for justice, remembering, is God himself, okay? He is the fount, in the technical term philosophically, of these things, okay? In other words, the origin of the source, right, the fountain. To attack the law, not that the law is God, okay? The laws, or just taken singularly, the law is the commandments of God, right? By virtue of its origin and source, to attack the fruit is to attack the tree, to use it by way of analogy. Does that make sense, right? You can't just simply bifurcate or separate the fruit from the tree, right? Because the byproduct is just that, a byproduct of something else, causally speaking, okay? To attack the law is to attack God, not because the law is God, but because the law comes from God. Okay. That aspect, that reality, in the kind of philosophical sense, is something deeply foundational to really this entire argument or discussion about humanity and evil and corruption and the will and all these like deeply, profoundly metaphysical things in theology and philosophy. Things which, of course, are discussed ad infinitum by the greatest minds throughout history that have ever lived around the world. To be in error regarding these things leads you to conclusions that just simply alter the very perception of reality around oneself. Right? And that can cut in 1,000 different directions and everything else in between. Right? These are fundamentally essential questions to who we are, to what is the world around us, what is our purpose in the world, how does the world relate to everything within it, how does it relate to the divine, to God, all these kinds of things, okay? That's why even such a seemingly pithy question, as I referred to earlier, is the law evil, has just such a manifold outworking of implications depending on how one answers that. Okay. We've already done, if this was in a completely different context, we would have to do the necessary work of defining what on earth we mean by the law, but we've already done that, right? This book has already done that, okay? We know and understand that this is referring to God's law, okay? Not just the Australian tax code or something like that. They're slightly different. Slightly. Yeah. So then the real question is on that second operative word there, of course, being evil or sin, right? Is the law sin? Is the law evil? Okay. that in this aspect, when we have that in mind, that's why I'm saying this here, to keep that in mind, that when that question is posited, it is ultimately a positing of a question concerning the nature, not just of the law, but of the lawgiver. Okay, once you see that, you'll then start to be able to understand why he says what he says. Even though he himself, as in referring to Paul, does not literally spell out in the wording of what I just said, which is that an attack on the law is an attack on the lawgiver. He doesn't have to use that phraseology, right? I'm explaining that as the actual contextual background or undergirding through which and by which he then says what he does say. Okay? So, how does he begin? Well, he posits a counterpoint. Rather, in other words, like on the other hand, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Some translations might say here lust. Long story short, the Greek word is talking about, we actually have a much better word in English for this via Latin, concupiscence. In other words, desire. It's a generic term, right? So the desire to do that which is wrong in the face of that which is commanded. Okay, it is the concupiscence is just the deeply historic philosophical term for what happens when you tell a 5-year-old boy that he is not under any circumstances to do X, Y, Z thing, right? Something really stupendously obvious, right? Don't. I don't know, you can pick anything you want here. Obviously, the old cookie jar thing is a good example. There's paint that Dad's doing when he's repainting one of the walls or something, and then little Timmy is told under no circumstances are you to go in there and pick up the paint, and of course you come home to find the entire rest of the house repainted in bottle green, or whatever lovely colour Dad's deciding to paint the new room, right? You get the picture. Concupiscence is desire. It's desire, and obviously when we think of the term lust, we think in the sexual context, which is fair. But there is a much deeper sense of in the spiritual or in the not just psychological. That's not the right word in this context, but the spiritual side of things, of the desire for the forbidden. Right, this is obviously like deeply Garden of Eden type context. Okay, that is drawn from various sources, of course, originally from the external. Okay, this touches on something that is, and this is why I said earlier. I mean, this is something that every major religion or philosophy or ideology in one form or another addresses. In a very wide spectrum of how coherent or logical or even sensible they actually are. But alas, this kind of thing is something as central to humanity as you could possibly envision. Okay, so when he speaks of covetousness, what he's really ultimately talking about this idea of concupiscence, of the desire for that which is not rightfully yours, is the really more popular level, non-academic, simplistic way of thinking of it. Okay. He's not doing that by accident. Okay, so it's important to understand that he's not just using, like picking a random one of the 10 Commandments, which I might do in a sermon, for example. If I'm just using the example of a law and I'm just wanting something as a stand-in for that, picking you shall not murder or you shall not steal, right? That's just an example. This is not what he's doing. Okay, it's extremely important. Otherwise, you won't get what he's saying. Right? This is not a random example of the law. He's actually honing in on the 10th commandment purposefully. Okay. Question, of course, then being why. Well, we address this actually because we're going through Deuteronomy, as you know, on Sundays. Right, as we've been doing for years now. You have the Deuteronomic commandments, so the 10 commandments that are given or retold again, reminded of in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Okay. Exodus 20 is the first time that comes down. Then now, 40 years later, in the chronology, it's being reminded once more for the new generation in Deuteronomy 5. Okay, so we went, obviously, when we were going through that chapter in the 10 Commandments, we went 10 weeks, week by week, through each of the commandments. Okay, What was explained back there, apart from the fact that they're in what we call the two tables of the law, right, which are grouped as they are, at least in the, again, different Christian traditions have different specific divisions of the numbering, but there's 10 overall, obviously, we all agree on that. What for us in the Reformed Protestant tradition is 1 through 4 and then 5 through 10, okay? In their orientation toward God and toward fellow man, okay? The two tables of the law, as we often call it. The other important aspect of that, which was explained all the way back then in those sermons from June 25, is that the 10 Commandments are also bookended, okay? With the first, right, you shall have no other gods before me. That then informs the other remaining 3, so 2, 3, and 4 for us, commands in divine orientation, the vertical orientation, okay? So because you shall have no other gods before me, you shall therefore not make idols, right? Da, da, da. That works in the inverse in terms of the source or the base, the underlying reasoning when you get to the other side of it, right? So that's why I say bookended, right? So what the 10th commandment does is it forms the basis or the foundation for commands 5 through 9, okay? So ultimately, why does someone steal? Well, it's covetousness. It's desiring that which is not yours. Right? All these kinds of things, right? So that's why you get this shorthand list of that are given, and it is only a shorthand list, in the 10th commandment of, say, for example, you shall not covet your neighbour's wife, or you shall not covet his livestock, you shall not covet this. Well, okay, so if you covet his livestock, let's take an example in this agrarian society, obviously the ancient world, what does coveting it cause you to do? Well, it causes you to steal it. Right, so you understand what I'm saying too? So yeah, so you can fill that in however you want. It is the desire for that which is not rightfully yours. That's what covetousness is. It is forbidden desire, it's illicit desire. So because of that, the 10th commandment is the underpinning, it's the foundation for what then occurs in those other commandments. And the other layer of that is even in the actual concept of source or outworking, okay, from therefrom, right? What do I mean by that? The 10th commandment of that second table of the law, so commands 5 through 10, the 10th is the only one in the direct sense of the wording, right, that is inward. Okay, so there's no such thing as like externally coveting, right? Covetousness is within the heart, within the spirit, okay? The desire begins within the mind, within the will, and then leads to evil actions, right? Now, the distinction I'm drawing is this, because the immediate thought might be, well, doesn't that also exist for the other commandments, right? So, for example, does not Christ say, you have heard it said you shall not murder, but I say to you, if you have hated your brother, you have already murdered him in your heart, right? So the letter of the law, spirit of the law. That's true, but that's not what I'm referring to. That's also not what he's referring to, right, St. Paul? Because the command ultimately in that regard of you shall not murder, right, whilst having a spiritual underlying principle that undergirds or brings into being the outward letter, right, the command is the outward letter in its ultimate sense, right? So you shall not murder is actually not just only talking about having hatred in your heart. It's actually literally talking about murdering someone, right? Unjustifiably killing someone, okay? The spirit of the law is the basis behind why the letter of the law is written, but it's still addressing the actual letter of the law. In other words, it's still addressing the outward, right? Murder, theft, adultery, these are all outward actions, okay? So what Christ is doing when he addresses the Pharisees and the Jews of his day who have completely rendered the law bereft of any of the spiritual element at all, right? It's all entirely external, outward religion, right? Ergo, you are whitewashed tombs filled with dead men's bones, right? So your hearts are like open graves. He's actually really quoting from the Psalms and everywhere else, right? That's what that's talking about, right? It has, Second Temple Judaism, for lack of a better term, had been rendered an entirely externalized religion, right? The inward reality was irrelevant, right? Which, of course, A, for starters, utterly defeats the purpose, but B, isn't actually what the law was or ever was meant to be in the first place, okay? Yeah. The sacrifices of bulls and ox I despise, right? Rather, it is the sacrifice of a humble and a contrite heart, quoting elsewhere in the Old Testament, right? It is the inward spiritual reality that is actually the ultimate thing that God seeks. It is, to use the operative phrase in the Old Testament, the sacrifice of thanksgiving. Okay? That is the phrase that's used in the Old Testament. Which is why then precisely you get into the New Covenant, and what is the fulfillment of the sacrifice of thanksgiving that is prototyped in the Old Testament? Well, it is just literally the sacrifice of thanksgiving, which in Greek is known as Eucharistos, which in English is known to you as the Eucharist. It's Holy Communion. We are offering a sacrifice of thanksgiving, right? So that's why even the words of institution, when we obviously perform Holy Communion, and we, as the ministers, consecrate the elements, blah, 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 partaking, participating, by faith, through the Holy Spirit, by faith, with thanksgiving, right? That's the element that's important. Getting back to the point, covetousness is the only one of the second table of the commandments that is, in the letter of the law, inward, okay? Because the reality is that covetousness fundamentally is inward. It may be tempted by things outside, right? Ergo, you shall not covet your neighbour's livestock, okay? But the covetousness is not out there somewhere. It's in the human heart. That is the fundamental problem, okay? So that's why it performs the same function to the second table as the first commandment provides for the first table, okay? It's bookended in that sense. So he's employing this idea of covetousness, or in the broader philosophical traditions, we call it concupiscence. He's picking up on that for a very, very, very important reason, okay? Because it's the law of God, and more importantly, what it is highlighting is not just simply externalized. It is an internal problem within mankind, right? And it is through the denial of the law of God that mankind attempts to absolve himself of sin, or can attempt to absolve himself of evil, by externalizing it, right? So evil is something out there, right? Very, very, very few people that you would ever encounter in life would ever genuinely believe that evil doesn't exist, right? In fact, I've never really met anybody, right? And I've, of course, had these kinds of conversations ad infinitum, right? I've never met a human being in my life, in thousands of hours of discussions on these things, probably more than 10,000 now these days, who's ever actually seriously believed that evil doesn't exist. No, everyone believes evil exists. Everyone knows what that really means. Everyone knows that evil exists, except the delineating point is that it's entirely externalized. It's something, it's insert this people group, or it's this person from history, or it's pick what you want, right? It's always something else, right? At the same time, fundamentally believing that they themselves are good. Okay, that's the modern issue, right? But it's not the denial of evil in totem, it is simply the externalization of evil, okay? What he's doing here by using covetousness as the point, not just merely as a standing example, is he's touching on something extremely important, okay? To remind you what the full sentence says, rather, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. Right, we've already talked about that already, but in previous lessons. But the law reveals sin. It doesn't create sin, but it reveals it, right? Okay? So if someone or something is standing in the dark, right, shining a light on it doesn't poof magically bring it into reality. It just shows you what's already there, that was hidden but is now able to be seen. Do you know what I mean? Right. It's the same thing, right? So he has come to know. In other words, knowing meaning being aware, knowing obviously, knowing meaning realization, knowing meaning acknowledgement, right? So he's actually speaking about literally intellectual and spiritual knowledge, right? Come to know sin except through the law. I would not have come to know except through the law, right? The whole point is this is that aspect of the mirror that we've talked about, the threefold use of the law before, okay? It reflects back on mankind and shows us the true image of what we are. Fallen, corrupted, evil, okay? For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said you shall not covet. Because what he's saying is, it is actually natural, post-fall, to mankind to covet. Because covetousness is a sin that begets many great sins. Okay. Now, pride is often hailed as the arch sin, and there's certainly truth in that, right? So pride, it is prideful to think that you could or should ever covet something that does not belong to you and actually belongs to someone else. So pride obviously undergirds covetousness, but the point being here is that covetousness is that which flows to or through those various other things that are mentioned in the second table of the law, like we're talking about earlier, right? But without that clear example of you shall do X, Y, Z, or you shall not do in this case, so a negative command, right? You shall not covet, right? What is there to say that we should or should not covet, right? Well, there is something, right? There is what mankind had prior to Mount Sinai, and that is the conscience. Okay? So there's never that you can read from Genesis 1, verse 1, and just start reading, and you're eventually going to get into chapter 4 of the book of Genesis, and you're going to find out about a guy who murders his own brother. But what you're not going to find out is where on earth God said, hey, by the way, do not murder your brother. Okay. So then when God punishes Cain, how is that fair? Why, was there ever a command to not murder your brother? Where was that ever spoken or written? Well, nowhere. But it didn't need to be written anyway, because the law was written on the human heart, right? The spirit, containing the conscience, right, is an essential component of being made in the image of God. Shattered, broken, fallen as it now is, by the time you get to chapter 4, alas, and nonetheless, knowledge of these things, right, was there. Except for the problem of what happens when people decide to not listen to that conscience. Well, that's exactly what St. Paul has already explained in chapter 1 of the book of Romans. Do you see what I mean? Remember in the introduction I explained that much of his basis for his explanation here, even though he does not directly say it, he's already explained things back in these early chapters. Well, that's how this is playing out, right? Because the conscience, prior to the actual giving of the letter of the law, quote unquote, at Sinai, was on the heart, was a spiritual component of mankind, right? That was created by God into Adam, and obviously subsequently Eve. Mankind has the capacity for suppressing that conscience, right? For ignoring it, for going, in other words, going against it, right? For going against it. Everyone does it. Everyone knows that they do it. And then when someone like me comes along and highlights it, I know that you know this. And I know that you know that you do this. And I'm more than happy to tell you that I know that I do it. And now you know that I do it. Ta-da-da-da-da. Right? Because that's what human beings do. Right? Is my point. Okay? It is what human beings do. This is just manifestly evident from the entire history of mankind. Okay? It's why parents, and by parents I mean even just normal parents, like not like terrifyingly horrible people. I mean actually just even just normal parents. No normal parent teaches their children in the most obvious sense to just like become a habitual liar. Okay? They can, I'm saying they don't necessarily, right? Parents, as a general rule, don't want their children to lie to them, right? That's just in modern Western culture, descending from thousands of years of Christian history. Important caveat, okay? Because culturally, we have had a long-lasting heritage of moral and civic virtue. Okay? That even though people have utterly abandoned the source of that in great lengths now today, by virtue of percentages in the population, they are still ingratiated in this tradition, cultural tradition, of what right and wrong generally is. Okay? As much as that has been changed, altered and varied, there are still core fundamental things where, again, someone who ends up having a child who grows up and goes on later to commit like murder, so let's just go straight to A to Z, at what point in their childhood did they ever actually grow up being taught and instructed by their parents to murder? Well, never. Okay, right. They just do it. Okay, this is the thing. What that does, right, and you can take that at great extents and scales all the way down to even smaller or pithy things. Regardless of what you're talking about, anywhere on that spectrum, what that does philosophically is demonstrate this precise point that I'm making, okay? Which is that the suppression of the conscience is evident from that. Okay? Because human beings, when they're honest, admit and know that they know what is right and wrong. Okay? And that can only be explained by virtue of not just merely common culture, although that's of course deeply influential, but of common source, or in other words, common origin. Right? It must come from a particular unified source if it is to explain why humans have this unified experience, okay, that clearly is separated from the material for very obvious philosophical reasons, right? How on earth can complete, utter, bare material reality in the atheistic sense produce consciousness, let alone a conscience? Well, it can't, right? This is the absurdity of where atheism ends up, which is why whenever this has ever been debated at the academic level, you've just kind of got the atheist flopping around like a fish on the stage because they have no answer for it, right? They can't explain the existence of the mind in the abstract sense, let alone the conscience, right? How does blind evolutionary processes stretched out across aeons of infinitesimally small genetic adaptations at the level of genomes and alleles produce the mind of Mozart? The commands of mighty lawgivers throughout history that have given laws that, based on human desire, in our own personal experience, actually go against the grain, right? Like, hey, you're actually not allowed to just kidnap people and enslave them. Because that's actually not a natural conclusion of the human experience at all, right? Me, big army, big weapons. You, small army, small weapons. Me, big, powerful. You, small, tiny. Me, take your thing. Me, now have your thing, right? That's the basic logic. So why not? Right, because there is actually a higher source of authority. Okay. So, therefore, to wrap up this verse, his knowledge of covetousness comes from the law. And when I say knowledge of covetousness, I mean knowledge against coveting, right? That's obvious. Comes from the law, not from within himself, right? That's why I made that discourse just then about the conscience. Because what he's not saying is, oh, we don't have a conscience. No, that's not what his point is. Because he's already established at the very beginning of this book that humanity has the capacity for suppressing the conscience, it is therefore not an obvious conclusion simply from the fallen human conscience that coveting is wrong. Because human beings are uniquely adept at self-rationalizing and coming up with all kinds of excuses to justify ourselves, right? In ways that can cause us to do tiny little things in the grand scheme of the world literally mean nothing and that no one ever really finds out about, all the way up to at its worst and greatest extents, the worst genocides in the history of the world. Right, so the scale of this is just astronomical, okay? It is not natural for him to know, for us to know, that covetousness post-fall, right, because of the corruption of our human condition, is wrong. There is something necessary to show or to shine that light, to be a mirror, to reflect back on us and show us the true revelation of that. That is what the law of God is, and that's what he's saying, okay? By saying that, he's already now established a fundamental goodness to the law, which is obviously what he's going to conclude by the time we get to verse 12 anyway, okay? Because it's not that the law is causing covetousness, it is that it is showing or revealing it, okay? So, this is why he then now says verse 8, a very interesting verse here, okay? So verse 8 of Romans 7. But sin, i.e. evil, taking opportunity through the commandment, worked out in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Right? There's a number of things to unpack here. Evil, sin, did not originate from the law, but it seized an opportunity in this phraseology he's using here through the commandment. Right? And it worked out in me, worked out literally meaning like to exercise or to actually perform a function. Right? That's what that term means, especially in the Greek. Worked out in me or performed a function in me of coveting of every kind. Okay? What on earth is he saying by this? Because he's talking about evil in an almost an anthropomorphic sense. He's almost talking about it as if evil has a mind, right? But he's speaking philosophically here, okay? So he's attaching strategy and planning and action to this to be able to explain the point, right? Sin taking opportunity through the commandment worked out in me coveting of every kind, okay? This is why, again, coveting is the example being given, okay? Here's how, or here's why I say that, okay? When he employs a phrase, I'm trying to think of the best way to start. When he employs a phrase like sin taking an opportunity through the commandment, A, for starters, identifying that it cannot be the source, right? Because if he was trying to say that it's the source, keeping in mind obviously he's defending against the claim, is the law evil, right? If he were actually making an argument and hypothetical that the law is evil, right, it would not be phrased in such a way of saying that evil took an opportunity through the commandment. It would just simply be essentially saying something to the effect of, but evil as the basis of the commandment, or as the foundation of the commandment, right, as the source of the commandment, right? By using a phrase like taking opportunity through the commandment, it inherently delineates between the sin or the evil and the commandment itself, right? In essence, he's almost attributing a parasitic kind of relationship between evil and the law, okay? Where one, and here's why I use the term parasitic, one feeds off of the other, okay? The parasite obviously feeding off of the host. It uses the host. It exploits the host. It manipulates the host, right? These kinds of things, okay? Even that word I use there in English of manipulate, right? To manipulate the host, okay? To exploit it, for example, right? Is precisely what, like I referenced earlier, was going on even in his day in the first century, where the law had been completely externalized with no internal reality at all among the rabbis, right? In anything they were teaching or blah, 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 right? So what they say did not line up with what they did. Okay, they were hypocrites. Of course, he calls them that directly to their face multiple times for that reason, right? Does Christ, right? But this parasitic relationship, taking opportunity through the commandment, it's even that's why we get the word opportunistic, right? In that, and obviously we use that in a negative sense, generally speaking, right? Sometimes it can be positive, but generally negative in common parlance, at least. Evil acted opportunistically through the commandment because In essence, these commands, again, are fundamentally good because they are from God and God is good. Okay? So you shall not murder is a good command. Okay? You shall not steal is a good command. You shall not do this, you shall not do that, whatever else. Or the positive commands, you shall keep the Sabbath, so on and so forth, right? You shall honour your father and your mother, right? But in this fascinating way, again, that is just manifestly obvious throughout human history, you see where the command is given, but then the command is disobeyed. Just like in the form of coveting, because the very act that began this entire problem, and by entire problem I mean the fall of mankind, was, among other things, a gigantic act of covetousness. You may eat of any of the trees in the garden for your good, but you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which then becomes the exact one that they desire to eat from, which is then the one that they attempted to eat from, which is the one that they do eventually then eat from. You know what I'm saying to you? It's just a whole exercise in covetousness, right? There's many other things going on there as well, but covetousness is very much at the, pardon the pun, root. That is the essence of taking opportunity through the commandment, because even the first commandment that was ever given, you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what then happens immediately after that command is given? Well, a sinful, evil being then uses that commandment and makes an opportunity of it to entice, tempt mankind to rebel against God. Obviously, we can jump into the realm of the hypothetical to explain a deeper point about this. Hypothetically, if there was no specific command against eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the word was just simply, you may eat of any tree in the garden, full stop, well then, where would the temptation have been able to come in? In other words, what specifically would the ancient serpent have been able to latch onto? Well, hypothetically at least, nothing. Right? We start to get off into the weeds of what ifs that kind of end up being irrelevant at a certain point. But hypothetically, the answer would be nothing, because it is that specific thing that he does latch onto. It's that exact thing in an entirely parasitic way. Right? So what is happening in Genesis 3 on the side of this seraphim, this serpent, is parasitic by nature. So the ancient serpent, so Satan doesn't create the world, he doesn't create the garden, he doesn't create the tree, he doesn't create Adam, he doesn't create Eve, he creates nothing. In fact, he himself was created. And yet, he bends all of those things, apart from God, to his will. Right? It's entirely parasitic. Right? Parasites by nature do not create anything. Right? Parasites only take. They consume, they rob, they steal, they kill. That's what parasites do. Right? Hence why a parasite cannot live without vampirically destroying a host, something else. It has to take. So all of that language of taking other things and do it, well, that's just covetousness. It's just it's covetousness by other names. Is it not? Right? So what that even means, again, even though Satan is most cardinally associated with pride, and rightfully so, there is another very serious thing that, of course, is deep at the very essence of who he is, and that is covetousness. Because ultimately, right, he wants to become God. He covets. That is the actual fountain of his own rebellion, personally. He who desired to become like God. Which is why his arch nemesis, the Archangel Michael, his name is a rhetorical question. Who is like God? Question mark. That's what that name means. Michael as a name, right? It means who is like God? Question mark. Because that question is aimed directly at his enemy, Satan, because the answer is no one. Right. That's not by accident. Okay. Right. His name is an accusation. His name is an attack on his arch enemy, Satan. Right? he who desired to become like God is answered with the question of who is like God? No one, being the rhetorical answer to that question, the answer to that rhetorical question, sorry. Right? So covetousness. Okay. This is why even in Dante's Inferno, right, part of the Divine Comedy from Dante, late Middle Ages, the ninth circle of hell, the lowest and worst place, is an icy frozen tundra. I've probably spoken of this before, where traitors are held, right? And treason is taken in the Divine Inferno, in the Divine Comedy, in the Inferno specifically, as the worst thing that can be done, right? And that's a pretty fair assessment, right? Because Satan does betray God, right? It's treason against God that he commits ultimately. But treason is, and treason that's actually treason, not the kind of, not evil powers then determining that someone's a traitor, right? Which would be a false accusation of treason, right? But actual straight up treason, real treason, right? Unjustified treachery against authority, right? Treason. Treason itself is born of covetousness, right? It's born of covetousness. Judas betrays Christ for 30 shekels of silver, 30 coins, right? It's treasonous that is born of covetousness. His love of money, okay? His greed, to be the specific term in relation to Judas, right? Is what led him down that garden path. It's covetousness, right? And you see that play out all throughout Judas's life in the Gospels. You see that in all kinds of things. You see that, I mean, even the coveting of relationship to the affairs of how Jesus' ministry is operating. Like, for example, when Judas chastises the woman for the perfume and the feet and the blah, blah, and for the anointing of Christ with that, this and that. Oh, we could have used that money for charity, blah, blah, blah. No, that's all rubbish. You're not some bleeding heart who just is thinking too much about the poor. No, you're the one who wants to control the finances. That's why, right? Because that would give the opportunity to steal from them. That's what that would do in terms of opportunity. It's covetousness, right? And the coveting, even the coveting of self-righteousness, because there is a sense in which self-righteousness is itself covetous by nature, right? So self-righteousness, when we use the term self-righteousness, we employ that term in modern English to denote someone who is, well, it's employed incorrectly all the time, but when employed accurately, self-righteousness is the act of someone claiming righteousness that they actually do not have. Do you understand? That's what really self-righteousness is, okay? It's misrepresenting yourself, right? Acting high and mighty if you're not actually high and mighty in that sense. I mean, no one calls itself that, but you get my point, right? Acting as if you are of this great moral stature, but you're really not, right? Okay, that's self-righteousness, right? And obviously falls into hypocrisy at some point, but you get the point. It's self-righteous, okay? So that's coveting something that you don't have because you haven't earned it, right? It's misrepresenting yourself. So see how all this in one form or another just ties back to covetousness. This is exactly my point about the Ten Commandments, okay? Evil, sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, delineates sin and the commandment, right? Because if the commandment was evil, in that sense, then evil wouldn't be taking an opportunity through the commandment, it would just be the commandment, right? So his entire point is that evil and its relationship to the commandment is actually parasitic. Now the question is, how does that actually play out? Like, why is he, in other words, why on earth is he even making this point, right? What's he identifying when he says that sentence, right? But sin taking opportunity through the commandment worked out in me coveting of every kind. Well, what he means in essence is the fact that where there is the command, he's really speaking about the human condition here, or the human nature, where there is the command, do not do X, Y, Z, mankind is now tempted to do the thing that God said not to do. Because of course that is exactly what Genesis 3 is, right? Now, that's why he says specifically, for apart from the law, sin is dead. Dead just meaning it's not there, it's not alive, it's gone, right? So what he's fundamentally saying is, of course, if there was no moral law of God, well, then there would be no law breaking, obviously, right? If there is no law, there can't be the opportunity for law breaking, which again might also erroneously lead you to conclude, if you don't think it through philosophically, that God therefore is the origin or the source of evil because he gave the law and human beings violate the law. Therefore, it's the lawgiver who gave the law in the first place that must be evil, right? That would be the shallow philosophical reasoning that just fails to consider this other extremely important point, right? Which is this. When mankind is now presented, in just a generic sense, with the opportunity to disobey God, if we go all the way back to the primordial setting, literally in the case of Genesis 3, did Adam and Eve have to do it? From the human perspective I'm talking about. Well, no. No, but they did. Right? They weren't, it was not as, again, no one in the history of Christianity has ever taught some kind of ridiculous idea that, like, I don't know, that, how to phrase it, like that Adam and Eve were really, like, they were actually going to obey the command, but then like some spell was cast over them by the serpent or by God or by, I don't know, a tree nearby or something else, and then they just like all of a sudden, you know, just did it even though they wanted to do it, and they all kind of, and then like, oh, what happened? No, this is like, it would be a ludicrous rendering of what's going on there. No, they're presented with opportunity and they cave in. There's so many layers of complexity to what happens in Genesis 3. That's not one of them. Opportunity to rebel against God. Do it. It's just that straightforward. I'm oversimplifying it, but either way, that's the point, right? That's what happens. Okay. Externalized temptation that then starts to build up within, in terms of the heart moving further and further and further away from what it should do, and then eventually just falls over the top, right? Which is the physical act. But again, this is actually directly to his point, okay? The nail in the coffin is the taking of the fruit and of the eating of it. But God explicitly identifies when he condemns them what the actual sins were. So the actual direct, and this often gets lost sometimes, just when people, because we know the story, but then often we haven't gone like meticulously through the chapter and like literally read word for word what's being said, which is understandable. When God pronounces judgment on Adam, he specifically, as in God, specifically identifies what the sin was on Adam's part, right? Because like it's obvious that eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the physical external act, right? He almost doesn't need to mention it, right? It kind of goes without saying. But the actual source and origin of the sin on Adam's part, God explicitly says to him, you listened to your wife to obey her, right? You took your wife's lead. You did not do your job, which was to protect not just yourself, but more importantly in this case, your wife from evil. So his own effeminacy was actually the chief sin on his part. Like God explicitly says that to him. Okay? Adam's weakness. All right? He should have protected Eve and thereby himself, right? By stopping the situation before it actually even got to the point of the problem. But he didn't. He just went with the flow. It was weakness. It was cowardice. It was effeminacy. It was all manner of things along those lines, right? So what that's demonstrating is that the actual eating of the fruit is but the finalization, the culmination of the problem, of what happens there in the fall. Because it actually begins in here. Further back up in the chapter. That's what's happening, right? So on and so forth, okay? Hence why he is saying here that what the law does in presenting the commandment of God, you shall not do this, is it now creates opportunity. Will you obey that or will you not? Okay, that's what verse 8 is meaning. For evil, taking opportunity through the commandment, not that the commandment is evil, not that evil is the commandment, but evil takes opportunity through the commandment. Because without the commandment, there would not be the opportunity for it. Right? Okay. Why then did God give the law? Right? That would obviously be a kind of pertinent question, right? We're going to get to that in a minute, right? But let's keep going through verse 9. Now I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And this commandment, which was to lead to life, was found to lead to death for me. What on earth is he saying there? He's highlighting his own Pharisaical past, right? Keeping in mind that the Apostle Paul was a preeminent Pharisee right? And in verses 9 and 10, he is in very shorthand passing fashion referring back to his own, he's referring autobiographically, right, to his own personal life, okay? I was alive apart from the law, and when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. That's his way of saying, well, I was just a model, noble, upstanding Jewish Pharisee who absolutely believed that he was righteous and was keeping God's law perfectly and everything else, until I then realized that I was absolutely full of it. Right? Is basically what he's saying, okay? Right? So when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. Right? He's speaking in this kind of symbolic language, right? Poetic language, right? He realized that he was he himself thought that he was righteous and good and obeying God's law perfectly, and I'm a Pharisee and I do this and blah, 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 and people look up to me as an exemplar of moral virtue, I then actually came to realize when Jesus Christ appeared to me that I am dead in my trespasses and my sins, and I am so up the creek without the paddle that I don't even realize how bad of a situation I'm in, right? Because I've spent all of my youth deceiving myself into thinking that I am just God's gift to mankind, right? That I'm righteous, that I am the moral example unto everyone, because that's what we Pharisees are, right? But it's all baloney, right? Because that's exactly what Christ says to all these guys. It's what he says to it's what he's saying to the Pharisees and to the Sadducees and the chief priests, and he says it even to the high priests, right? They are all apostates. They have rejected God. They've rejected his law, right? The irony of ironies, the people who have believed themselves to be the greatest keepers of the law in the world were some of the worst of it. In fact, in Christ's own eyes, the worst of it, right? Because the pagans weren't actually given elements of those laws that they were given, right? They weren't given those things, okay? Paul makes that point, in fact, for us in Romans chapter 4, I think, if I remember correctly. Right. Blah, blah. And so they had no excuse. They had no leg to stand on, right? They were the worst of it, right? Hence why he says, apart from the law, so I was alive apart from the law, which is an ironic statement because he believed he actually had it, right? So he believes he's all honky-dory. But when the commandment came, inferring the true commandment, right, Christ, sin revived and I died. And this commandment, which was to lead to life, was found to lead to death for me, right? Because I believe what he's saying in that poetic sense there is, to translate, is, well, as a Pharisee for me, the law was my path to salvation and righteousness, right? No, I just do the law and I keep the law and I'm good and I'm righteous and God loves me because of it, and that is the path to God. That is exactly what the path to God was in the religion of the rabbis, the rabbinical religion, which is exactly what it then becomes in Judaism that's born out of that, right? It is the keeping of the law to be righteous. That's what makes you righteous. Okay? But what human beings do, and this is of course manifestly evident in the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Jewish rabbis of those days and beyond, is that if your path to God is through moral law keeping, you're eventually going to run into problems like when every man and their dog can admit to themselves that they don't perfectly do that. So now what do we then do? Well, okay, we have the sacrificial system, right? God has provided a means by which we atone for sins, okay? But now, what happens when that's gone? Because that goes after the crucifixion, and not figuratively, right? It is reliably recorded by contemporary sources, right? That, like Josephus and others, that during the days of the temple, including even up to the days in which Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, a miracle would occur every single year on the Day of Atonement. Okay, this is not written about in the Bible, but it is written by promise in the Bible, and it then is confirmed elsewhere in historical sources. Right? The Lord famously says through Isaiah, "Though your sins be like crimson, I shall make them as white as wool." Right? Well, they had a practice all throughout the Second Temple period, right? Certainly at least into the first century, where a piece of dyed crimson wool would be sprinkled with the sacrificial blood and then would miraculously transform white. Okay? That's not specifically written in Scripture, but even I'm saying that is reliably recorded by contemporary eyewitness story accounts from the first century. Okay? In fulfillment of the words of Isaiah. Now, why on earth is that worth mentioning? Well, because the very same sources that identify that was a miracle that occurred in the temple on the Day of Atonement among the Jews, then also records that for reasons unknown to those same Jewish rabbis, that stops the exact year in which Jesus was crucified. And the crimson wool no longer transformed white, and the doors of the temple involuntarily opened by themselves. Okay? That's Jewish sources record that, not us. Right? And none of them can explain it. Because the sign that they had that the sacrifice was received and confirmed by God no longer was happening. And they start freaking out. Okay? It's not Christian sources that say it, it's Jewish sources that say that. Okay? That's the point, or that's the essence of what I'm referring to, or what in this case, what he's referring to, right? It is through realizing that he in fact actually is not able to enter paradise, to reach union with God through his own moral law keeping, that caused him to realize, as all humble people do, that apart from God, we cannot save ourselves. That no amount of doing good can ever change the actual fact of occurrence that at certain points we did evil things, we did bad things, right? I'm saying it's the fundamental, we've talked about this before, obviously, so I don't want to go back down the same path, but it's the fundamental philosophical flaw with the Eastern conceptualization of good and evil in a karmic worldview, okay? Because you can't just undo the occurrence of those things, which is why reincarnation and the universe being eternal are philosophical requirements for Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and so on and so forth, because only through, not that they think in the rational sense, but only through rationalizing, lowercase r, rationalizing constant, literally eternal reincarnational cycles, can the idea of undoing past evils even begin to try and make sense. But it ultimately falls into 10 other pitfalls, because now you've eternalized the cosmos, which means the cosmos has to be divine, which then now as soon as you end up realizing, and by you I mean human beings, that the universe is not eternal, which we definitively know, your entire religion doesn't work anymore. Do you understand? Like, Hinduism should have died in the 19th century when we definitively, categorically learnt what Christianity has been saying forever and a day, which is that the universe actually had a beginning. Right? Any Eastern religion just fundamentally does not work from that point, right? Because this is beyond dispute at this stage. Right? We know that it had a beginning. Right? This is the problem that Einstein faces, because Einstein was a Buddhist. Right? Yes. Not to the degree that your average, like, Buddhist monk sitting in Tibet would be, but held Buddhist, Eastern Buddhist mystical beliefs. Yeah, absolutely. Certainly early on he did. And so he held to the belief that the universe was eternal, but then his own mathematical equations are discovering that it's clearly not, right? So we're talking early 20th century here by this point, and all kinds of things, right? Blah, blah. Point being that he realizes, Paul, coming back to the Bible, that St. Paul realizes that this law, this commandment, so this verse 10 I'm talking about here, this commandment, which was to lead to life, this was what was meant to lead to eternal life, because eternal life, in my Pharisaical belief and worldview, was I keep the law and I then earn paradise in an oversimplistic sense. Right? When I sin, when I do evil, it's absolved by sacrifices and the train just keeps on rolling. Well, but now our crimson piece of wool is no longer miraculously transforming white. And the temple doors are opening and closing by themselves. So something's gone wrong here. Right? None of this is working anymore. And then, of course, you fast forward 40 years later, and the same guy who told you that the temple was going to be destroyed and an apocalypse would descend on Jerusalem, then, of course, turns out to be right when the Romans descend upon you in 70 AD and the temple's destroyed. So you're now faced with a choice, right? Not Paul, because Paul's converted by this point, but there are plenty of his other contemporaries who have not yet converted by this point. So now you're faced with an existential cultural choice that will literally determine the fate of your people, right? In the most historical sense, that's true, right? Either you realize that the guy who said that all these things that were going to happen has now been proven to be true, because after all, they've just happened exactly how he said they were going to happen, which means that the other things he also said were true, like I'm God and I'm going to take upon myself your sins, and I'm then going to rise from the dead. And you all know he's risen from the dead because the tomb's empty, right? Your own sources record that just as ours do, right? The one thing that every single person on earth agrees is that the tomb of Jesus Christ is empty, right? You just deny the thing that was staring you right in the eyes because you all saw it. He appeared before countless hundreds of people, right? This wasn't some hidden thing. The tomb is like barely a couple of kilometres away outside the Jerusalem walls anyway. It's not off in some random part of the wilderness somewhere, right? So now you're faced with a choice because you have no temple. So where are you going to do your sacrifices? Well, you can't. Because that's the point. Because the sacrifice has now already been made, the ultimate sacrifice. God himself becoming a human being and then in his humanity sacrificing his life, bearing our sins, dealing with the justice of God and the wrath of God, and then rising from the dead to release us from the captivity of death, right? This big ontological, philosophical movement to rescue us from evil and the death that comes about as a result of our evil, right? And
is that when the wool stopped going white?
No, it stopped. It stopped in the year they record. The Jewish sources record that it stopped the year that Jesus was crucified. So the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, is now big. Exactly as I'm saying. There's all these fascinating historical tidbits that come from outside Christian sources, which influence and impact these things. I can talk about more during Q&A if you want, during the discussion time if you want, if I remember. But no, so for 40 years, roughly 40 years from the time of Christ's crucifixion to the destruction of the temple, approximately 40 years. It's a bit less than that, but roughly 40 years rounding off. They're still performing sacrifices. But this sign that they had, this miraculous event that they record, is no longer happening.
They didn't tweak.
That would be the operative thing. Yes, exactly. That's the pertinent question. It did not quite twig. Well, it's not so much. It's a perfectly valid response. For them, the issue. This is the fundamental problem. It's not so much a matter of not twigging, as much as it is a problem of not wanting it to twig, because the Jewish people just come into a very fundamental decision. You either recognise the obvious thing staring you in the face, or you confirm your rebellion once and for all. And that's just unfortunately what it is. So there are obviously plenty of ethnically Jewish people who become Christian in that first century and beyond, but then there's a host that don't, right? Jewish sources like Josephus, who's one of the primary sources from the Jewish side of things in the first century, he estimates that about a third of the Jewish people around the world became Christian in those days. About 2/3 did not. Right? Paul was one of only a handful of Pharisees. That's the general populace. It was much more disproportionate among the clergy. So like the rabbis and the Pharisees and blah blah blah. Almost none of them became Christian. Paul was one of a handful. Very, very limited group. Alas, that's what he's referring to in verse 10. Okay, so he came to realise that this thing that I thought was actually the path to paradise for me, keeping the law, is actually the very thing that condemns me to hell. Because I'm actually not perfect, and I'm not righteous, like I thought I was. And the sacrifices of lambs does not actually absolve the sins in the way that I want them to. It covers them, but it doesn't absolve them. Right? Something else was required. So then verse 11, for sin, taking an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. That's what he's saying. Right? The self-righteousness of all, it was deceptive. Right? I was living under an illusion. Right? Of my own making, of others' making, it's not just one or the other, right? It's all taken together. It's this big cultural exercise, right? But it was deception, right? And that's the thing, is that we talk about that concept ad infinitum. We won't do it necessarily here, but this is why so much of things that, say, for example, here are taught are about not just knowing what we think or believe, but knowing why, because of the fundamental Christian position that God is himself logical. In fact, he is logic in that sense of the logos, right? He is rational, which is just another simple word for logic. There is a coherency within God. There's no contradiction within God, in other words, by definition, right? He wouldn't be God if there was. And so therefore, that which he has made, at least in the fundamental essence, is coherent. It is logical. It makes sense, to use the common parlance, right? The mere fact that someone believes, this is more a generic point now, but the mere fact that someone believes something does not actually determine whether or not the thing that is believed is true, in fact, right? In that literal sense, per se, right? Per se meaning in itself, okay? So it is not per se true, i.e. in itself true, simply because you believe it to be true, right? That's the problem with having a purely subjective view of truth, okay? The mere fact that you believe it to be true does not therefore mean it is true, right? It actually has to be put to the test to find out whether or not it's true. And of course, there's a variety of ways in which we do that, right? That's a different subject. But in this particular aspect, what he's pointing to is the fact that, no, I was deceived. And he doesn't just mean I was deceived by external things, because not just the external, because that's his entire point about the relationship between law and evil anyway, right? Or law and sin, same thing, right? The external provides opportunity, right? But it's the internal that actually is the cause, because that's precisely what his phrase means back in verse 8 when he says, but sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, right? So taking opportunity, not through itself, but through the commandment, which means the commandment provides the opportunity for sin. You can read that reverse if you want to, right? Sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, also means the inverse is true, right? The commandment provides the opportunity for sin. You could say it one way or the other. It's the same point, right? That's the entire essence there of what he's communicating in that regard to deception, right? So the external deceptions of the culture in which he lived do just that, provide the opportunity. But it's also in tandem or relation to he himself as an individual, right? This is why at the end of the day, ultimately, every one of us individually will give an account for our lives. Right? You will not simply be allowed to rest upon, oh, well, I was influenced to do this, or I was moved to do that, right? No, you will give an account to God for your own soul. Because and this is super duper important to understanding the metaphysics of evil. The operative word that he uses in all of this in relation to that dynamic between law and sin is opportunity. We just mentioned that. What that means, and the reason why he's using that word, is because the most that it can do is present opportunity. Okay? There is not an actual sense in which external factors literally cause you to take internal actions. So, I'll just save us time and jump right to the most extreme example, okay? Which is the example that has caused every single martyrdom in the history of Christianity, okay? Deny that Jesus is God. Okay, but I'm holding a gun to your head, right? Now, you can rationalize that as, well, I'm being forced to. No, you're being threatened to, but does the pulling of a trigger, the dropping of a hammer, the firing of a pin, and the miniature little explosion with gunpowder that occurs when firing a 9mm bullet out of a barrel actually cause you spiritually to internally go, Jesus is not God? No. No, you reach a decision point where you will either be faithful to him or you will betray him. That is only confirmed, finalized, by you outwardly professing that. Now, notice what that is. That is the exact, and I mean the exact dynamic of what happens in the garden. We already talked about that earlier. The eating of the fruit was the culmination of the rebellion, of the sin, not the beginning of it. Because God already then goes on to tell Adam that his sin was in obeying his wife. Okay, well, that happens all the way back up here earlier on. That happens by him listening to her. That happens by him internally making the decision to not do the right thing, but instead to actually abandon his duties and his responsibilities before God and to his wife. Right? And then is confirmed by eating the fruit that she hands to him. Right? Because she eats, and she then hands it to him. That's what happens. Okay? It's the same dynamic. It's the same dynamic. Right? This is why the martyrs of Christian history are so reverenced and venerated, rightly, because these are people who were captured and tortured and dragged into a Roman Colosseum or dragged into a public square, or wherever they were, and were then put before intentionally starved tigers from the Orient and said, worship the emperor and deny your God, or we will feed you to these tigers. And you just reach the culmination of your entire existence, reaches a singular finite crossroad. Yes or no? Do you understand what I'm saying? This is an unfathomably, and this could be an entire lesson in itself, I know. But this is I can't begin to stress to you how important a point this is in terms of not just even Christian existence, but just human existence almost, right? It's just something so fundamentally deep and profound to the philosophical existence of mankind, is that the reality is that you have agency and you make decisions, right? Even in the face of tremendous temptation, even in the face of tremendous enticement, even in the face of tremendous coercion and manipulation and outward pressure, right? Outside pressure assailing against you, it can be just, and it can be to shockingly overwhelming degrees, right? This is why, as Christians, the general impetus that we are commanded to live by and abide by is humility, not the kind of self-righteousness that looks down at others. Because, and this is of course the essence of, remove the log in your own eye before you judge the speck of someone else's, right? Because, say for example, you'll never hear me ever sit around looking at the life of Solomon, the ancient king of Israel, and going, oh my goodness, oh what a failure, oh this guy, right? Oh this guy, I can't believe he did these things. Right? Look, this guy had been given everything by God, and he just squanders it all, and has a meteoric rise and just one of the greatest falls. It's like this story of Icarus. Are you kidding me? Just being blunt, like I know what it's like to be tempted at that level. Oh, you're only the most powerful king in the ancient Near Eastern world. Oh, you only have the most powerful and influential royal court in the entire world. Oh, you only have every single pagan king throwing his daughter at you for marriages of alliance. Oh, you only have all the wealth. Oh, you only have the most powerful army. Given that now the Bronze Age collapse has happened, the Egyptians have fallen off a cliff, the Hittites don't even exist anymore, right? You've conquered basically all of Canaan almost. Blah, 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 blah. You get the point. You got no idea. No, I've got no idea. Are you kidding me? I'm going to look at that guy. I'm going to look at him and look down my nose at him as if I have any idea what it's like to be under that kind of pressure. It's ridiculous. It's just such arrogance. Such arrogance. I have no concept as to what it's like to have that proverbial sword of Damocles hanging over my head. Right? It's just absurdly prideful to look at some of these people. I mean, even David, but Solomon's is just far surpasses what his own father faced. Right? That point that I'm drawing is the fact that is to make this essential point here of the fact that at the end of the day, externalized factors, even though they are overwhelming, are not actually causal for internal spiritual actions. Right? They can greatly influence you. They can drag you right in a direction that you never thought you would end up. But those are all ultimately influence. They're not cause. Do you understand the distinction? They're not cause. And as harsh as it might seem, it only seems harsh because we as people self-rationalize. Because at the end of the day, whether I like it or not, you like it or not, anyone likes it or not, the reality, when we're honest, the reality is that there comes a juncture of decision. There comes a point in which we decide to go left or go right. Decide to do this or that. To do this or to not do that. Whatever the dichotomy is, right? Whatever the thing is, right? Even if it's a multiplicity of paths, it doesn't matter. There is ultimately a decision point that is reached, okay? Because all that the external can do is influence. It cannot cause. Even in that most overt example that I use of like the literal threat of death, right? Doesn't actually cause you internally. The reason why is because of something we have covered actually quite often, which is the difference, ontologically speaking, between the material and the spiritual. Okay? Even the threat of death, that is purely a material source or action, not a spiritual one. Ergo, fear not he who can kill only the body, but fear he who can kill both body and soul in hell. judgment. Because the most that the material can do is impact the material. Right? So like if they shoot you, you're dead. Right? So no amount of like spiritual discipline or prayer is going to causally stop the bullet from flying out the barrel in terms of you personally. Now God might intervene miraculously. That has happened many times in history, right? Of course the vast majority doesn't, because that's not the point, right? That's God's decision. But my point is that some spiritual decision on your part doesn't impact the material in that way, right? But vice versa is true, because the material cannot determine, is the operative word, the spiritual. It can influence the spiritual, but it can't determine, right? Things like drugs, like narcotics, right? Cocaine, meth, whatever, pick whatever you want. These are all material substances, right? We know that, okay? But what can they cause? Well, they can cause addiction, right? Which is now blending into the spiritual. It's the same thing with like gambling, like poker machines, right? For example, right? People who are utterly addicted to throwing their life away and ruining their lives and ruining everyone's lives around them, right? On the surface, it's just simply a person sitting at a machine, well, they're not even pulling a handle these days, it's all just buttons, pressing a button and having like bright lights and flashing sounds and all this kind of thrown in their face to just like hypnotize you. But at the end of the day, what's that doing? Well, it's driving this literally like zombie-like compulsion. Right? We're well beyond the material at this point. Right? This is something spiritual. Cool, but it doesn't. It's influence, though. Do you see what I'm saying to you? Right? Because and the reason why we know that is because I or loads of people can just walk past a poker machine and go, and just keep walking. So clearly, it's not some kind of actual magical power in the poker machine that like sends you into some trance. Yeah, exactly. Right. It can't be, because otherwise you can't explain why everyone else walks past it and literally doesn't think twice about it. No, it's influence. Influences. When you understand that, you begin to that is the building block for understanding how life is and should be lived as a Christian. Right? Even though we fail. Right? Even though multiple times we fail. Right? That's not the point. Right? Failure is expected because perfection is not our natural state. Right? The problem is not in falling, the problem is in failing to rise again by the grace of God. Okay? That's why the wisdom literature says that the righteous fall 7 times, yet rise again. Okay? 7's a lot more than 1. Right? The point is that when you understand this, and understand what he's saying here, right? Deceived me and through it you killed me. Is that the external can only influence and manipulate and coerce, but none of those are causal. Right? And I'll finish this point with the new locus of history, the new event around which all of modern history now revolves, which of course is COVID. Everyone reached a point of decision. Well, okay, I can tell that whether or not I tell or not, it doesn't matter. A very tiny minority of people, proportionally speaking, genuinely thought that these decisions being made and these proclamations being given by governments and experts and so on were actually like, really coherent and super blah, blah. I'm not convinced by anything that I've seen in that period or even afterwards that the majority of people thought, yes, these guys are all telling us the truth. They haven't lied about anything. They're absolutely dead correct. Now, that would be like the cultic side who believe in the technocratic scientism of the modern era, where the experts are treated functionally as like a priestly class. Sure, right? So among professions or among academics or among whatever, yes. But your average Joe Blow who just like works at a cafe or who's a plumber or who is insert whatever, is just reaching a decision point where they're either going to acquiesce and to surrender to the manipulation, the coercion that is manifestly coming from these people, or you're not. Now, the vast majority of people did. They submitted to it, right?
Because of consequences.
Because of consequences. It's exactly right. Yeah, so exactly. And that's why the balance is, I've always maintained the balance, right? I don't pretend that that there wasn't just unfathomable pressure to do this and to. I've always been honest about that. That's obvious. That would be ridiculous to insinuate otherwise, for obvious reasons. Which is why, if you did stand up against it, I mean, you have survived the single largest propaganda campaign in the history of the world. And that's just fundamentally true. There's never been a scenario where every single national government, combined with every single international body and advisory committee and corporation, has continually bombarded you with an explicit authoritative directive to do something that is fundamentally against your self-interest and, more importantly, the interest of your own loved ones, right? Like, take an experimental drug that we have no real long-term studies on at all, and let's just kind of see how it goes based on a promise that we already know is BS already. Like, it'll stop transmission. Okay? Right? They knew that. This is not up for debate. This is fact. This has been revealed through emails. This is revealed through official documents. This has been confirmed in United States Senate committee hearings. This is not up for debate. Right? These are facts. Okay? They knew it. The National Health Institute in America knew it. Fauci, who ran the entire operation for the world, knew it. He was saying one thing publicly, saying other things in private emails. They knew it wouldn't stop transmission. They knew it caused defects and deformities for pregnant women. They knew it caused cancer. They knew it caused myocarditis. They knew it caused all these things. This has been confirmed. There is no debate. Okay? None. And I don't abide by anyone who would debate it. Okay? Because you're willfully ignoring it. People died. People were killed. Right? Particularly young people. At least proportionally speaking as a percentage. Right? So it's not things that I will stand by and just let kind of just roll on. Right? But eventually people reached a decision. So I'm not pretending that there wasn't overwhelming pressure. Right? But people eventually reach a decision like, are you going to abide by this mandate or not? Are you going to go along with this thing or not? Right? Now, I don't condemn people in some carte blanche, one and done, see you later sense. Right? That would be ridiculous, because I actually believe that there is forgiveness. Right? There is. 100%. Right? If people have come to realise that after the fact, even if it's realising after the fact, right? Well, praise God, you've come to realise it now. Okay? Wasn't very helpful back then, but alas, we're human beings, right? I'm not so arrogant as to think that we're not, okay? But now that you have realised there's forgiveness available, there's repentance for it, right? The point is that was one great exercise in terms of vivid, real-world, real-time, historic demonstration of this exact point. External influence can never literally cause you to do something. It is something that is a decision or a point, an action, whatever you want to tell me it is, that is undertaken spiritually. Right? That's what this is. Because as he ultimately and finally concludes, verse 12, the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Okay? So ultimately, the answer to verse 7, is the law sin? Is the law evil? No. Because, verse 12, the law is holy, righteous, and good. And the law is holy, righteous, and good because the lawgiver is holy, righteous, and good. Okay? So the law does not possess, the divine law does not possess within itself self-generating holiness, self-generating goodness, self-generating righteousness. What we would say is auto-generating, right? Self. Okay? The holiness, the righteousness, the goodness of the law did not originate within itself, because it is sourced in another thing outside of itself, namely God. Okay? That's where it draws this from. Okay? Because God is the source of those things. Right? Just as the source of our life is God's existence, God's life. Okay? His being. Right? That's why he breathes into Adam and he becomes a living being. Right? All these kinds of things. That's the answer. That's why evil is this parasitic thing in that archetypal sense, right, or typological sense, I should say, sorry, that seeks opportunity through the law. Because what is evil, ultimately in the philosophical sense? It is a negatory thing. In other words, it does not have positive quality. Light is a positive quality, right? There are photons. Okay? Darkness has no positive quality. Okay, there isn't a substance called darkness, right? There aren't particles floating around in the shaded parts of this room that are separate from the photons that are in the. Do you know what I'm saying to you, right? It has a negative nature, not a positive one. Okay, darkness is the absence of light, and that is what evil is to good, right? That's why when I mentioned the term parasitic, which is what ultimately, as a word, is his point in verse 8, right? Sin takes opportunity through commandment, right? Sin or evil is parasitic by nature because it has no positive quality, okay? Because evil is the absence of good. Because, and that's explained very clearly by implication from verse 12. If the law is good and evil is disobeying the law, that means, therefore, what? That evil is the absence of the law, right? So, using Genesis 3 as the example we've used consistently here today, if God says, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you then do it, the violation of that command, in other words, right? You have failed to actually do the law. Because doing, in the most simplistic sense, the law, or the commandment in that case, would require you not to eat from the tree. Make sense? Okay. So by eating the tree, and again, it seems inverse because this is a negative command that's given, right? It's usually easier when we go with positive commands to make the example, even though they're both equally true, right? Let's just pretend, for example, hypothetically to make the example, that the command was to eat from a certain tree, but then they fail to do so, and that's the sin, right? That's a usually more obvious example when you use positive in relation to the negative, right? Well, it's the absence of what they had done in that case. Do you understand what I'm saying too, right? It's just a bit more complex when you talk about negative laws, right? Do not do this, and then you do the thing, right? You're actually, ironically, not doing the thing because you were told not to take from it, right? So the positive action is actually a negative one philosophically, right? Because you were told not to do it. So you haven't done the thing that you were told to do, which was not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay. So it's negatory, i.e. negative. Okay. In less philosophical, more common parlance, there is a gap. There's a chasm that exists between the thing you were told and the thing you did. That negative space, right? That is evil. And so that's why, beautifully and poetically, the Greek word for evil, at least in terms of biblical application, hamartia, is a term taken from ancient archery. Okay? The literal meaning is to fall short of the target. Okay, so it's taken from warfare, it's taken from archers. Okay? So the idea of hamartia, sin, evil, is falling short of the target you aimed for. So the Greeks had this philosophical concept in the idea of sin or evil of exactly what I'm talking about, or what he's talking about, or I should say Paul, but what I'm talking about, right? Evil has a negatory element. It's negative, right? It's the absence of something, okay? So if the archer hit his target, right, there's nothing missing, right? He doesn't fall short. There's no gap, right? He hits the target. It's completed, right? But if he falls short of the target, right, he misaims, he misfires, whatever it happens to be, it could be a combination of both, right? There's now a gap between where he should have landed and where he did in fact land, in terms of the arrow, I should say, right? Do you know what I mean? So, falling short is literally negative in its space. Does that make sense? Okay. That's what I'm talking about with light and darkness. It's the absence, darkness is the absence of light, evil is the absence of good. Because what is good is do this thing, if that's what the law is, right? you shall honor your father and your mother. Or in the negatory, you shall not murder. Okay? So that's why you can flip and invert these kinds of laws. So for example, you can take the command of, you shall not lie. I know it's bear false witness, but let's just simplify it. You shall not lie, the ninth commandment. Well, what does that mean the command also actually implies? You shall tell the truth. So you shall not lie. The spirit of that law is you shall tell the truth. So now, let's just run with that. If you tell the truth, you've upheld the law. If you don't tell the truth, you have failed to uphold the law. You've fallen short, haven't you? Right, well, what do we call not telling the truth? Lying. Bearing false witness. Ergo, you shall not bear false witness. Okay, so each negative command, in that sense, has a positive inverse. Right? Lying and truth being the obvious example of that. Okay? By virtue of that, when we see and realize that negatory element, what you now hopefully, if I've done my job there and laid that out as plain as I can, hopefully what now I can help you realize is that the reason ultimately why parasitic must be the relationship between evil and good, or in this case, using the words evil/sin and the commandment, right, is because when we understand that evil is by nature negative, not positive, it has no creative power. It has no creative capacity. Evil can only corrupt. It cannot build. So I actually mentioned this in passing earlier, right? But to remind you and reference it again, if you look at the scene in the garden in Genesis 3, you have a being, the serpent, who himself was created by someone else, God, who did not create the world, did not create himself, did not create the garden, did not create the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, did not create the fruit in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, did not create Adam, did not create Eve. He then bends it to his will, though he created none of it. He changes the very fabric of the world by building nothing. Do you understand? Because evil, by its nature philosophically, cannot build. Yeah, because it's a negative. It's not actually a positive force. It's a negative. Right? It's the absence of goodness. That's what evil is. Okay? It has no positive nature or element to it. Essence, in other words. It has no positive essence. It only is the negation of the good. Because the law is good. The law is righteous because God, the lawgiver, is good and righteous. It can only corrupt and spoil. When you see that, I present to you as Exhibit A, the 21st century. Why is our architecture so just absurdly oppressive in how bland, dull, dark, and just ludicrously untalented it is? Because the architects, having so thoroughly abandoned God, right, cannot build anything that is truly beautiful, that is truly inspiring, that is truly indicative of the high virtues of civilized culture, right? No, it's just the most, a building goes up in Sydney and it's just the most ludicrous, embarrassingly dull, bland, and just spiritually depressing design, right? This is why cityscapes of the International School of Architecture, which has transformed everywhere from New York to Sydney to Hong Kong into the same city, just varying in scale, with gigantic glass and concrete boxes called skyscrapers. It's literally all the same, right? Filled with cubicles that are varying shades of the grayscale, right? that have none of the architectural beauty and aesthetic, in the literal sense of the philosophical category, aesthetic quality of Gothic architecture from 1,000 years ago, right? With architects and stonemasons and everyone else working with literal chisels, building things that we quite literally cannot build now. Not necessarily by virtue of the technology, although some of it actually is. It's such, a lot of it was such artisan skill that's actually been literally lost. We wouldn't know how to do it. But in the general sense of actually building things, we can't do it because we don't have it in here anymore. We don't have it in here, right? We can build it in the technological sense, but we don't have the will to do it because we have become so cold and bland and uninspiring and ugly within us that that's just reflected in the external things that we build. The music is atrocious outside of rare exceptions. It is bland. It's not written by the people who actually perform it. It's not produced by the people who perform it. They're literally just puppets on a stage. So the actual literal sense of genius in that Greek concept, right? The aspect of the muse that inspires is gone. It's absent, right? Because the people who actually perform the music that sell tens of millions of copies around the world, well, none of them write it. They all have writers. None of them produce it. They all have producers. They don't even fund it. They have record studios and labels that produce it, that do it all for them, right? They're just puppets on the stage, right? On and on and on and on. Every movie, right? The movies are written so atrociously bad, uninspiring characters. There's no genuine heroes. The villains are constructed by buffoons. Like, it's just all disaster, right? Outside of exceptions. I'm talking in the general sense, right? All these things in terms of civilization that are just so bland and cold and decaying and degenerate and just falling around. That's why. Because evil has no ability to build. It can't. It literally can't. It's not like it doesn't want to. I'm saying it can't. It has no power to build anything. It can only corrupt, just like the parasite that it is. The parasite cannot actually create anything. It has to attack and then leech off of the host. It has to feed off the host, it destroys the host, it takes over the host. But it can't just be its own thing. The parasite is vampiric by nature. That's what evil is. When you see that and understand that, you will understand the world around you in our day. And more importantly, you will learn how to safeguard yourself from that. This is why my consistent thing to leave you with this point for our time today is, and I get asked these things all the time, especially as a pastor, right? I can give you 100 different things that if someone threw a crown on my head today would fix all kinds of things, right? Not because I'm some genius, but because there are things that I've studied, things that I've learned, things that I've read from people who actually know what they're talking about, so on and so forth, that I know would fix this and this and this and this and this and this. But none of it would actually work at this particular juncture because we've so lost ourselves spiritually, we've so lost our way, right, that there would be people screaming and baying to go back to what we had, even though what we had is not working, right? Like, let's just say I use, for example, the housing crisis that every Australian who's not living under a rock somewhere knows is a problem, right? You've got housing prices that are just exorbitantly beyond what anyone is actually meaningfully capable of getting into in terms of entrance into that market, quote unquote, right, market. You have places like in Sydney, which has, I mean, pretty much apart from Hong Kong, the most expensive housing market on the planet, right, to such an absurd degree, right? I mean, you're basically up to a point now where, at least in the broader median sense of, or the average sense, I should say, sorry, of the Sydney housing market, the housing prices are basically up to 1.8 million. That's what the average is sitting in, right? Coming out of COVID just a couple of years ago, that was only about 1.1 to 1.2 million, depending on what you're talking about, right? We've gone from 1.2 to 1.8 in like 3 years, 4 years. Okay, it's an absurd jump. Right? It's literally just absurd. We're talking like Weimar Republic levels of absurd, right? Well, there's a number of things that would fix that. But the fundamental problem, and by fix that, what that means is prices going all the way back down into the hundreds of thousands by considerable margins, and by hundreds of thousands, I mean like low to mid hundreds of thousands, that people could actually afford, that would be in proportional ratio to what we used to have where, say for example, 50 plus years ago, the average housing price, or the median housing price in this case, I should say, was about 3 years worth of your annual wages, right? It's now up to like 18. It's an absurd number, right? So you're talking about housing prices needing to go down to about 300,000 to 400,000, right? On average, I'm talking, okay? Well, that would fix your housing crisis. There's a number of steps you could take to fix that housing crisis, except for the fact that everyone would realise that they could no longer sell their house for 1.8 million. And we're too greedy, and because everyone in this country, using in the general sense everyone, not literally everyone, you get my point, right? A great swath of the people, from the corporations to the government, or various governments in the case of the states, to foreign corporations, to individual investment groups, to even just individual investors themselves, or just people in general, right? Everyone, quote unquote, figuratively, broadly, has their finger in the pie. No one's willing to actually sacrifice for it, right? That's why it's become basically a quasi-cult in this country, right? It's become, because this country has been convinced that the way that you make wealth is through real estate, everyone's on the Ponzi scheme and no one's willing to jump off the train first. Even though the train is heading straight off a cliff. No one's willing to jump off the train. And what does that mean? Well, we're all just going to take it for the ride. Okay? That fundamental essential point of things that could be fixed, boom, 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 wouldn't waste my time with. Why? Because the problems aren't just out there, right? Everyone are realising that things aren't okay. Oh, politicians this, oh, corporations that, oh, foreign corporations that, blah, 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 blah. It's all this externalised. All our politics is all external, right? No, actually, where you need to start is not what's going on with Rio Tinto, or what's going on in Canberra, or what's going on in Ukraine, or in Israel, or in London, or pick wherever you want. No, where you should be starting, if you actually want to have a future worth living for us as a people, is in here. It's in here, right? We need a spiritual revitalization of our people, because we are dead. So dead spiritually we don't even realize it. We are zombies sleepwalking through history. In the general sense, I'm talking generalities, not specifics. That's what we've become. Satiated and addicted to 10,000 things, right? Addicted to gambling, addicted to drugs and alcohol, addicted to sports, addicted to everything that is thrown at you as the consumer to dull your mind and to deaden your spirit, so that you can be robbed blind by the same politicians and the same corporations and the same this and that, right, who are fleecing you. And the whole thing is one gigantic enslavement spiritually. Amidst a time where the people consider themselves to be the freest people that have ever lived.
That's the deception.
That's the deception. Without being smart, that's the deception he's talking about. Because what he realised is that he was a slave. He was enslaved to his own deception, his own delusion of being self-righteous. And is not the ultimate form of slavery the slavery that you don't even realise you're enslaved to?
It's called the buy-in.
Yeah, exactly, right? At least the slave in ancient Rome, right, like a gladiator, or the guy working in some blooming silver mine in Greece, or pick what you want, right? He knew he was a slave. There was no confusion there. He wasn't under some illusion that he was free. No. It's the greatest deception, because it's not external. We've become spiritually enslaved. And that's the ultimate deception. So, let's end it there.